Hello, everyone. My name is Eliot Litalien, and I'm from McGill University. And the title of my presentation is Epistemic Agency, Individual Failings, Collective Responsibility. And so you might have gathered from the title of my presentation that I'll be talking about some sort of collective responsibility for individual failings in the domain of epistemic agency. That is exactly what I'll be talking to you about. And so here's the central claim for the presentation. The central claim is that when the relevant collective an individual epistemic agent finds herself in is in a position to help her satisfy certain epistemic norms that she, the individual agent, could not be expected to satisfy on her own. Responsibility for failing to satisfy those epistemic norms should be understood to fall at least also on the relevant collective. And so that's really the central claim of the paper. So what I'll try to do is explain how that makes sense. And so here's the plan to do that. So the first thing I'll do is talk about the relation between epistemic norms and responsibility, or you might say epistemic agency, epistemic norms and responsibility. That's a sort of the first section, sort of a setup for the paper. I'll present a view that is quite common today about epistemic responsibility, and then I'll try to show that there might be a problem with this view. I'll try to present a challenge to this view in the second section, in which I'll talk about cognitive and rational limitations that epistemic agents like ourselves might have, and that sort of maybe hinder, I guess, our capacity, a capacity that we have that is very central for epistemic responsibility, at least according to the view that I'll present in section 1. And then I'll suggest sort of a solution to the challenge, which is not to reject the position that I'll present in section 1, but is to say that, as I say in the central claim here on the slide, to say that maybe individual epistemic responsibility or solely individual epistemic responsibility might not be the way to go, and that we should actually maybe think about holding certain collectives responsible for the failings of some individual agents in the epistemic domain. Okay. So in this first section, as I was saying, what I'll try to do is first explain the relationship between, I guess, epistemic norms and responsibility, and present a view of epistemic responsibility that is that has a lot of support right now, or more support than it had, I guess, before. But I'll try to do that by first answering a couple of questions and follow-ups. And so here's this first question. The first question is, what is a good epistemic agent? And a very widely held answer to that question is that a good epistemic agent is an agent who satisfies or respects at least certain epistemic norms in the way she forms and maintains a variety of doxastic states, right? So just a note here, for the rest of the presentation, I'll talk about only one kind of this doxastic state, which is beliefs, but that's only for simplicity's sake. I guess most of the things that I will be saying about beliefs can be adapted or, adapted to other kinds of doxastic states. And so, again, a good epistemic agent would be an agent who satisfies at least certain epistemic norms in the way she comes to, forms or maintains beliefs. But what are the kind of epistemic norms that I have in mind, or actually the kinds of epistemic norms that I have in mind? Well, there are norms about how, again, one forms or maintains doxastic states. Norms such as, that one should hold only beliefs that are supported by adequate evidence or are adequately justified, or such as that, one should hold only beliefs that are coherent with one another, or that one should revise beliefs one has adequate evidence against, right? And so on and so forth. So those are the kind of epistemic norms that I have in mind when I say that, a good epistemic agent is an agent who satisfies certain epistemic norms. And those are the, those are the kinds of norms that epistemologists suggest, right? We should probably follow in order to be a good epistemic agent. The second main question is the following. So what is the relation between epistemic agency, right, and responsibility? I've just talked about the relationship between epistemic agency and epistemic norms, but what is the relationship between, or the relation between epistemic agency and epistemic responsibility? So the answer I proposed for the first question, I think is quite widely held, not only amongst epistemologists, but I guess I would say more widely than that. But the response that I'll sort of offer here to the second question is less widely held. It's a view that has been defended in recent years, or more and more defended in recent years by certain epistemologists. So an answer that we could give to this question of what is the relation between epistemic agency and responsibility could be to say, as different epistemologists have suggested, that one may be held responsible, right, for failing to satisfy epistemic norms, epistemic norms of the kinds that I mentioned on the previous slide. Also, well, and this is, I guess, the most controversial part of the view, but also, well, because just as is the case, with actions and practical agency, we have control over what we believe. Okay, so what I just did in the first section is present a specific view, right, about epistemic responsibility, and now in this second section, what I want to do is raise a challenge for that view. And the challenge I want to raise is not, what we should conclude from it is not that we should reject the responsibility as control account. I actually think that the responsibility as control account is quite good, probably correct. For one thing, it does make good sense of our epistemic practices because we do indeed, hold people responsible for their beliefs, and it seems like we do that because we think that they have some control over what they believe. And so I don't want to reject it. I don't want to reject the responsibility as control account. I just want to raise, again, a challenge. I'll challenge for it. So the responsibility as control account entails that we are to be held responsible for those of our beliefs that we have a capacity to control, right? It might be the case that that certain of our beliefs, certain kinds of beliefs, for instance, we have no capacity to control them. But at least if we do have a capacity to control our beliefs, we can be held responsible for those beliefs. But here's sort of the first part of the challenge, I guess. But human agents will often fail to satisfy epistemic norms, not because they fail to exercise, right, control, to intentionally exercise control over our beliefs, but because our capacity, or their capacity, human agents, right, their capacity to do so is in important ways limited. So what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that as human agents, we have cognitive and rational limitations that impair our capacity to effectively control our beliefs. So we do have, right, a capacity for, say, critical reflection, but we also have cognitive and rational limitations that will impair, I guess, this process of critical reflection, and at the end of the day, also, therefore, our capacity for control over our beliefs. And so even if an agent tries to intentionally exercise this form of control, again, through something like critical reflection, or through the actions of inquiry, evidence gathering, and so on and so forth, the limitations I'm talking about, the cognitive and rational limitations I'm talking about, can importantly hinder that process and can importantly impair, I guess, our capacity to effectively control our beliefs. But what are the kind of limitations I'm thinking about? So here's a non-exhaustive list. We might note, right, as many people have, I cite Cherniak, but we might note that we have finite cognitive processing powers, right? We have a limited amount of cognitive processing powers. We also have what Stanovich has called contaminated mindwares, right? So we have erroneous or dysfunctional sets of beliefs that impair us in our capacity to reason rationally, for instance. And then we have also what Stanovich has called mindware gaps. I'll come back to that in a moment. And finally, again, this is a non-exhaustive list, but finally, we often, our cognitive processes are often heuristics or system one cognitive processes. And we also, additionally, we also have like a much harder time, right? Engaging in system two cognition. And so I don't want to spend too much time on all of those, but I'll just say a few words about the mindware gaps and the system one cognition, just to show what I think the link with responsibility might be. And so mindware gaps. So what are mindware gaps according to Stanovich? Well, they are missing reasoning capacities, procedures, or strategies. And just to make clear what they are, I guess here are two examples of mindware gaps. So two very common mindware gaps concern, on the one hand, probabilistic reasoning, and on the other hand, reasoning that involved the consideration of alternative hypotheses. And so here, the idea is really just that, people in general, right, that's statistically true, I guess, but people in general have a very hard time doing probabilistic reasoning and also doing reasoning that involves, right, the consideration of alternative hypotheses. But what does that have to do with responsibility? Well, the idea here is that even if an agent, right, acts responsibly in regards to her beliefs, by trying, for instance, to engage in critical reflection, if she has that kind of mindware gaps, she will most likely fail to satisfy the relevant epistemic norms, at least when the mindware gaps that agent has would have been useful in, forming certain kinds of beliefs or maintaining certain beliefs, maintaining or, of course, revising certain beliefs, right? So if you have a hard time with probabilistic reasoning, for instance, and you are confronted with a situation that would require for you to go through probabilistic reasoning to come out with the correct belief, then even if you intentionally and quite consciously try to engage in critical reflection or the right kind of process in order to come out with the right belief, you will likely fail, right? And not because you didn't try, but just because you might have this mindware gap, right? That concern, of course, probabilistic reasoning. Okay, what about heuristics or system one cognition? Well, most of those heuristics or system one cognitive processes, right, express biases in such a way that their product is epistemically inadequate, right? But the problem here is that getting rid or overriding those biased cognitive processes is extremely difficult, if not impossible in certain cases. And so again, here, the conclusion that I take from that is that even if an agent acts responsibly in regards to our beliefs, say by engaging in critical reflection, if our beliefs are acquired or maintained through system one biases, right, she will most likely fail to satisfy the relevant epistemic norms. Or I say she will most likely fail to satisfy, but she might very well fail to satisfy the relevant epistemic norms, even if she tries to do so, right? And that's because, again, that's because of sort of a, I mean, of course, heuristics are also a good thing, but it is in some sense also a sort of rational limitation, or the rational limitation is rather not the heuristics themselves, but rather our immense difficulty to get rid of bad heuristics, or to override heuristics. When we recognize that they are embedded with biases, right? And so, what is the challenge that I'm raising here? Well, the challenge is that while we can control our beliefs, because of our cognitive and rational limitations, such control might actually be attainable quite infrequently. And as a result, many of our even quite ordinary beliefs might be out of our control, right? It's not that we can't engage in the actions or processes that authors that suggest a responsibility as control account suggest we should engage in. It's not that we can't engage in those processes or actions. It's that even if we do so, we might still lack or fail to have control over our beliefs because of our, again, cognitive and rational limitations. What does that have to do with responsibility? Well, as such, I think that we might not be responsible for many of the even quite ordinary beliefs we hold, and of course also for failing to satisfy certain epistemic norms when we form or maintain those beliefs. Okay, so where does that leave us? Well, one thing we might note here is that this seems to suggest that in many cases, individual human agents should not be expected to satisfy the sort of epistemic norms proposed by epistemologists. Yet, and this is an important part of what I want to suggest here, the groups or institutions in which individuals exercise their epistemic agency often are in a position to help them satisfy the relevant epistemic norms. Also, and this is a quite central part of what I want to suggest, collectives have an epistemic obligation to support the epistemic agency of individuals. Why? Well, I want to stay somewhat agnostic about the explanation for that. I don't want to commit to a specific sort of explanation, but there are, I think, different possibilities. One might have, for instance, a value-centered sort of explanation for this that has to do with epistemic values, or one might also have like a more deontic sort of explanation for that. But again, I want to stay agnostic on this question, and just the important thing is that I do believe, and I want to suggest here that collectives do have an obligation, an epistemic obligation, to support the epistemic agency of individuals. And we should also note that collectives can actually offer individuals opportunities to correct or palliate their rational limitations. That's the way they can support the epistemic agency of individuals. And well, what through means? Can they do that? Well, there are different ways, right? Education is one way, and I don't mean here only education for children, like formal education, but I mean education writ more largely, as it were, but also through prompts that would help individuals engage in the kind of activities that help them guide their beliefs. And I'm also thinking about things like what we might call epistemic nudges, and so on and so forth. And so, following from that, I have, I guess, two suggestions concerning epistemic responsibility. The first one is that because collectives should and can support the epistemic agency of individuals, ascriptions of epistemic responsibility should not fall only on individuals, but should also be distributed at the collective level. So what I'm trying to say here is that at least part of the responsibility for individuals satisfying epistemic norms should fall on collectives, at least in a context where collectives can, right, support the epistemic agency of individuals. But the second thing I think I want to suggest here is that we should still hold individual epistemic agents responsible for their beliefs, fully responsible for their beliefs when given the epistemic scaffolding provided at the collective or institutional level, they could be expected to satisfy the relevant epistemic norms. So if collectives do actually support in an adequate way, right, the epistemic agency of the individuals that compose them, I think in this case, right, it would probably, we might think it would probably be reasonable to expect that the individuals satisfy the relevant norms. And maybe then in a case like this one, the epistemic responsibility would not be distributed at the collective level, in the sense that, if an individual epistemic agent fails to satisfy, say, a relevant epistemic norm, right, we shouldn't hold for that failing, hold the collective responsible, right? And so those are really my two central suggestions. And I need to stop here. And so I'll just say thank you. And I'm really looking forward to your comments. Thank you.